Pull up a chair, stranger, and let me pour you a drink. A town like Deadwood. It's got more stories than it has gold nuggets, and most of them are just as dirty. This is a place built on greed, fueled by whiskey, and governed by the fastest gun. The law here ain't written in books, it's written in blood in the mud of the main street. The story I'm about to tell you is about a time when that blood belonged to the law itself. It's about a woman who was supposed to be a footnote in this town's violent history, just another grieving widow. But she refused to be silent. She decided that if the law was dead, then its ghost would have to learn how to shoot. Alright, the piano's gone quiet. Let's listen to the echo. Let's talk about Anna Mae Collins, and the night her voice learned to shatter the silence. The year 1879 found Deadwood, Dakota Territory, in a state of high, frantic fever. It was a town born of a gold rush, a raw, chaotic, and brutally alive place carved into the sacred Black Hills. It was a town of mud-caked streets, hastily erected timber buildings, and 1,000 men all clawing at the earth and at each other for a piece of the yellow dream. In a place like Deadwood, the law was not a foundation, it was a suggestion, a thin veneer of civility that was often washed away by the daily tides of greed and violence. The man tasked with maintaining that fragile veneer was Sheriff Robert Collins. He was a good man, a rare and endangered species in a town like this. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a steady hand and a quiet integrity that had, against all odds, earned him a measure of respect from the town's volatile populace. His greatest strength, and his only true source of peace in this den of wolves, was his wife, Anna Mae. Anna Mae Collins was a woman who seemed to be from another world. She had the quiet grace and gentle features of an Eastern lady, a stark contrast to the rough-edged, hard-living women of the mining camp. She was the town's heart, the keeper of its conscience. Her home was an oasis of calm and order, her garden a defiant patch of beauty in the mud-caked chaos. She was the sheriff's wife, a position of respect and quiet influence, and she was, in her own unassuming way, happy. This life was shattered in a single, violent night. Sheriff Collins had been investigating the Black Vultures, a ruthless and highly organized gang of outlaws who had been plaguing the territory. Their primary targets the heavily guarded gold shipments that were the lifeblood of the town's economy. He had been getting close, or so he had told Anna Mae in a hushed, worried whisper. He had ridden out with his two deputies to check on a lead at an outlying claim. It was an ambush. All 3 men were cut down in a hail of rifle fire, their bodies left as a brutal message. The town of Deadwood offered its official condolences. The town council, a body of powerful, self-interested men led by the saloon owner and mining magnate, Silas Croft, declared it a tragic loss. They promised a full investigation, but the investigation was a sham. The new acting sheriff, a brutish, lazy man named Cobb who was known to be in Croft's pocket, made a few cursory inquiries and then declared the case insolvable. The killer's long gone. Anna Mae, in the fog of her grief, knew it was a lie. Her husband had not been a fool. He had been a careful, methodical man. He had been betrayed. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as a gravestone, that the rot was not just in the outlaw gangs, but within the very structure of the town itself. The men who had shaken her hand at the funeral, their faces masks of deep, sorrowful concern, were the same men who had benefited from her husband's death. Silas Croft, the town's unofficial king, now operated with an open, unchecked impunity. The Black Vultures, far from being driven off, now moved through the town with a new, arrogant confidence, their presence a constant, low-grade threat. Her husband's death was not just a murder, it was a coup. The last bastion of true law in Deadwood had been removed, and the wolves were now in charge of the hen house. In the weeks that followed, Anna Mae's world was systematically dismantled. Citing a series of fabricated debts, Croft, through his control of the town's only bank, seized her home, her savings, everything she and her husband had built. She was cast out, left with nothing but her grief and a few personal belongings. She was no longer the respected sheriff's wife. She was just another one of Deadwood's unfortunate widows, a pathetic, powerless figure destined to fade into the town's brutal, forgetful history. That is what they all expected. They had underestimated the quiet woman with the gentle features. They had not understood that in burning down her world, they had not destroyed her, they had reforged her. Anna Mae took a small, mean room above the laundry, a place that smelled of lye soap and other people's grime. To the outside world, she was a broken woman, a figure of pity. She took in sewing, her head always bowed, her voice a quiet, submissive whisper. She became invisible, and in that invisibility, she began her transformation. Her grief, a vast, howling thing, slowly, painstakingly, began to crystallize into a single, cold, hard point of purpose. She would not mourn her husband. She would avenge him. She would not be a victim. She would be a reckoning. She used the meager coins she earned from her sewing to buy a single cheap, used pistol and a box of cartridges. At night, while the town was lost in its drunken revelry, she would slip out into the darkness of the surrounding hills. And with a relentless, obsessive determination, she began to teach herself to shoot. Her hands, once skilled at embroidery, learned the kick of the recoil, the steady squeeze of the trigger. She was a natural, her movements economical, her eye sharp, her resolve absolute. She did not just train her hand, she trained her mind. She began to listen, to watch. In her new, lowly position, she was privy to the town's secrets. She heard the whispers of the laundry girls, the drunken boasts of craftsmen, the fearful murmurings of the ordinary townspeople. She began to piece together the web of corruption that held Deadwood in its grip. She learned the names of the key members of the Black Vultures. She learned the secret partnerships, the backroom deals, the flow of stolen gold. And she began to find allies, not among the powerful, but among the powerless. An old, disillusioned prospector whose claim had been stolen by Croft. A stable hand who had witnessed the new sheriff, Hobb, meeting in secret with the Vulture's leader. A saloon girl who had overheard a drunken confession. They were a small, frightened group, an army of whispers, but they were united by their shared hatred of the town's new masters, and they saw in this quiet, determined widow a leader they could believe in. Anna May Collins, the gentle lady from the East, was gone. In her place was a creature of the night, a woman fueled by a righteous, burning fury, and armed with a growing network of secrets. The town had silenced her husband's voice with a bullet. They were about to discover that a widow's whisper could be a far more dangerous, and far more revolutionary, sound. In the raw, chaotic crucible of Deadwood, power was a loud and brutal thing. It was the roar of a shotgun, the slam of a fist on a bar, the confident, booming voice of a man like Silas Croft. Anna May's burgeoning resistance was its antithesis. It was a movement of whispers, of shadows, of a quiet, collective courage that was, in its own way, far more subversive. She knew she could not fight Croft's army of thugs with an army of her own. She had to fight him with the one weapon he could not see, and therefore could not defeat, the truth. Her army was a motley collection of the town's dispossessed, the people who had been chewed up and spat out by Croft's relentless machine. Her first and most crucial ally was an old, grizzled prospector named Cody, a man whose real name had been lost to the dust of 100 failed claims. Croft's mining syndicate had stolen his last, best claim through a campaign of legal intimidation and physical threats. Cody, a man who knew the Black Hills as well as he knew the lines on his own leathery hand, became her chief of intelligence. He was her eyes and ears in the wilderness, tracking the movements of the Black Vultures, mapping their secret trails, and identifying their hidden camps. Her second in command was a young woman named Sarah, one of the soiled doves from Croft's Grand Saloon, the Gem. Sarah was a woman of sharp intelligence and a deep, simmering anger, a woman who had been forced by circumstance into a life she despised, and who saw in Anna May a chance at a different kind of power. From her position at the heart of the town's social and political life, she was privy to the drunken confessions of Croft's lieutenants, the secret deals made in the back rooms, the entire, sordid machinery of the town's corruption. She was a spy in the enemy's headquarters. Together, Anna May, Cody, and Sarah formed the triumvirate of the resistance. They began to build their network, a conspiracy of the powerless. A stable hand who would accidentally lame the horse of a key Vulture member before raid. A Chinese laundryman who would listen to the gossip of Croft's men as he washed their shirts. A disillusioned bank clerk who would secretly copy the records of Croft's illicit financial transactions. Each was a small, seemingly insignificant act of defiance, but together, they began to form a pattern, a slow, methodical tightening of a net that Croft and his men did not even know existed. While her army of whispers was gathering intelligence, Anna May was honing her own, more direct skills. Her nightly sojourns into the hills were no longer just about learning to shoot. They were about becoming a warrior. She learned not just accuracy, but tactics. She learned to move in silence, to use the terrain for cover, to think like a hunter. Her husband, in his wisdom, had taught her the basics of tracking and survival, skills he believed were essential for anyone living in this unforgiving land. Now, she took those basic skills and refined them into a deadly art form. She began to take small, calculated risks, to test her own courage and the enemy's defenses. She would follow a lone member of the Vultures, a man she had identified as a key player in her husband's murder, for days, a silent and seen shadow. She would learn his habits, his routines, his fears. She was not yet ready to strike. She was gathering her own, more personal, form of evidence. She was learning her enemy. It was during this period of quiet, intense preparation that the outside world, in the form of the United States Marshal Service, finally intruded. The Black Vultures, in their arrogance, had made a mistake. They had robbed a federal payroll shipment, an act that finally drew the attention of the powers beyond the Black Hills. A lone U.S. Marshal was dispatched to Deadwood to investigate. His name was James Porter. Porter was a man cast in the classic mold of the frontier lawman. He was tall, quiet, with a square jaw and clear, honest blue eyes. He was a man of unwavering integrity, a man who believed in the simple, hard-edged clarity of the law. He was, in many ways, a younger version of the man Anna May's husband had been. His arrival in Deadwood was like the striking of a match in a gas-filled room. He was met with a wall of silence and obstruction. The acting sheriff, Hobb, was a model of uncooperative bluster. Silas Croft was the picture of a concerned, law-abiding citizen, offering his full cooperation while subtly directing his men to mislead and intimidate the federal lawmen. The townspeople, caught between their fear of Croft and their distrust of any outside authority, offered him nothing. Porter quickly realized that he was a man alone, a single, righteous gear in a machine that was thoroughly and completely corrupted. Anna May watched Porter's struggles with a mixture of pity and professional interest. She saw in him a potential ally, a man who shared her goal of bringing down Croft and the Vultures. But she also saw him as a threat. He was a man of the law, a man of the system. He would never understand, or condone, the kind of justice she intended to deliver. He wanted to put these men in a cage. She wanted to put them in a grave. Their first meeting was a tense, weary affair. Porter, having heard the whispers of the sheriff's ghost, the reclusive widow who never seemed to leave her room, sought her out, hoping for some insight into her husband's last investigation. He found her in her small spare room, sewing by the light of a single lamp. He saw a frail, grieving widow. He did not see the warrior who had been practicing with a colt in the hills the night before. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his voice gentle, respectful. "I know this is difficult, but I need your help. I believe your husband was close to exposing the truth about this town. Any information you could give me." "The truth, Marshal," she replied, her voice a soft, brittle thing, not looking up from her sewing. "The truth in Deadwood is that a good man's life is worth less than a bad man's gold. That is all the information I have." She had dismissed him, leaving him with the impression that she was a broken, helpless victim. It was a perfect piece of acting, a necessary deception. She knew she could not trust him yet. She had to see what he was made of. She had to see if his belief in the law was stronger than his fear of the lawless. Her army of whispers would continue to work in the shadows, and she would watch, and she would wait, to see if this honest lawman was a man she could use as an ally, or an obstacle she would have to overcome. Marshal James Porter was a man who did not believe in ghosts. He believed in evidence, facts, and the unyielding logic of the law. Yet, the longer he stayed in Deadwood, the more he felt he was chasing phantoms. His investigation into the Black Vultures and the murder of Sheriff Collins was met with a conspiracy of silence so absolute it was a tangible force. Every lead was a dead end, every potential witness struck with a sudden, convenient amnesia. He was an outsider, a federal agent in a town that was a closed, sovereign kingdom, and Silas Croft was its king. Porter was not a man to be easily discouraged. He began his own quiet, methodical investigation, working the fringes of the town's society. He spent his time not in the saloons, but in the miners' camps, in the Chinese quarter, in the places where the town's forgotten people lived. He was a patient man, and he was a good listener. And slowly, tentatively, the whispers that had been denied to him in the town proper began to find their way to his ears. He heard the stories of the ash-faced ghost, the phantom saboteur who was plaguing the railroad. He heard the tales of the avenging angel, the widow who was hunting the men who had killed her husband. He began to realize that he was not the only one fighting a war in this town. There was another, unseen force at work, a ghost that seemed to be one step ahead of him at every turn. His path and enemies converged over the body of a dead man. One of the key members of the Black Vultures, a man named Lefty Pete, a man Porter had been carefully building a case against, was found dead in a back alley, a single, expertly placed knife in his back. There were no witnesses. The acting sheriff, Cobb, ruled it a drunken brawl. But Porter knew better. It was a professional hit. It was an execution. He went to see Anime again. This time, he did not come as a polite, respectful lawman. He came as a frustrated, angry investigator. He found her in her room, the picture of quiet, domestic grief. "He was my best witness, Mrs. Collins," Porter said, his voice a low, accusatory growl. "Lefty Pete." He was about to talk. "And now he's dead. A coincidence, I'm sure you'll agree." Anime finally looked up from her sewing, her eyes as calm and as deep as a winter lake. "I am a seamstress, Marshall," she said, her voice soft. "I spend my days sewing and my nights grieving. I know nothing of the sordid affairs of men like Mr. Pete." Her denial was so perfect, so complete, that for a moment, he almost believed it. But then he saw it. A tiny, dark speck on the cuff of her simple, black dress. A speck that, to his trained eye, looked exactly like a dry drop of blood. He didn't press her. He simply nodded, and knew, profound understanding dawning in his mind. The frail, grieving widow was a lie. He was not just dealing with Silas Croft and his army of thugs. He was dealing with a second, and perhaps even more dangerous, player in this deadly game. The event that finally forged their unwilling alliance was an act of pure, arrogant brutality by Croft. Frustrated by Porter's persistent sniffing around the edges of his empire, Croft decided to send a clear, undeniable message. His target was the one person in town who had shown the marshal any kindness, the old prospector Cody, who had become Anime's chief of intelligence. Croft's men didn't just warn him. They made an example of him. They beat him senseless, burned his small claim shack to the ground, and left him for dead in the wilderness. It was Porter who found him, following the trail of smoke. He brought the old man back to town, to the doctor's office, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. And it was there that he found Anime, already tending to the old man's wounds, her movements deft and practiced, her face no longer that of a grieving widow, but of a grim, determined warrior. The masks were off. They looked at each other over the broken body of their mutual friend, and in that moment, they were no longer a lawman and a suspect. They were two soldiers in the same war, who had finally, officially, met on the battlefield. "This is my town, Marshal," Anime said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "These are my people. I will not stand by and watch him do this to them. This is my case, Mrs. Collins," he replied, his own voice just as firm. "And I will not stand by and watch you turn this town into your own personal graveyard. We want the same thing. We want Croft. But we are going to do this my way. By the book." "The book was burned with my husband's body," she shot back. "I will get Croft, and I will get him my way. You can either help me, or you can get out of my way. But I am done hiding." A fragile, dangerous, and absolutely necessary bargain was struck in that room, the air thick with the smell of blood and antiseptic. She would provide him with her intelligence, with her network of whispers. She would guide him through the dark, corrupt underbelly of the town she knew so well. In return, he would use the authority of his badge to give her the protection and the legitimacy she needed. And there was one final and spoken condition. He would pursue his legal case against Croft, and she would pursue her own, more personal one, and they would both pretend not to see the other's methods. The marshal and the ghost had become partners. It was an alliance that would either save Deadwood or burn it to the ground. The alliance between the marshal and the ghost was a potent, if volatile, combination. It was a fusion of the law's authority and the shadow's knowledge, a two-front war against the kingdom of Silas Croft. While Porter began to use his badge to apply official, procedural pressure on the town's corrupt institutions, Anime and her network of whispers worked to uncover the one thing that could bring the entire rotten structure crashing down: the physical proof of Croft's criminal enterprise. Their target was a legend in Deadwood, a mythical object spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, Croft's Black Ledger. It was said that Croft, a meticulous and arrogant man, kept a detailed, secret record of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every murder he had ever orchestrated. It was his insurance policy, his Bible of sin, the ultimate source of his power over the town's other respectable citizens. The ledger was the key. To find it would be to not just convict Croft, but to cleanse the entire town. Sarah, the saloon girl, listened for any drunken slips of the tongue. Cody, the old prospector, now recovering and fueled by a burning desire for payback, used his knowledge of the town's old mining tunnels to search for a possible hiding place. It was Anime who conceived of the audacious plan to find it. She knew that Croft, a man of immense ego, would keep the ledger close, somewhere he could admire his own handiwork, somewhere he felt utterly, completely secure. His fortress was his grand saloon, the Gem, and his sanctuary was his opulent, second-floor office. The ledger had to be there. Getting into that office, which was guarded day and night, was deemed impossible. But Anime did not plan to go in through the door. She planned to go in through the walls. She used intelligence gathered by her network, including the bank clerk who had seen the original architectural plans for the saloon. She discovered a forgotten, hidden space in the building's construction, a narrow, walled-off dumbwaiter shaft that ran from the cellar all the way up to the attic, passing directly through the wall of Croft's office. It had been sealed off years ago, but the shaft was still there. The plan was a daring, high-stakes infiltration. It would be a two-person job. Marshal Porter, with his steady nerves and his professional school, would create a diversion. And Anime, small, silent, and driven, would be the one to go in. The night of the operation, Porter staged his diversion. He chose a high-stakes poker game in the main room of the Gem, a game that he knew Croft himself would be presiding over. Porter, using federal funds, bought into the game. He was not there to win. He was there to create a scene. He played with a cool, deliberate recklessness, his bets growing larger, his presence a constant, irritating challenge to Croft's authority in his own saloon. He accused one of Croft's lieutenants of cheating, a calculated, public insult. The saloon erupted. A massive, chaotic brawl broke out, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater that drew the attention of every one of Croft's guards, who rushed to quell the drunken federal lawman who was tearing their place apart. While the chaos raged on the main floor, Anime, dressed in black, her face smudged with soot, was moving through the cellar. She found the sealed-off entrance to the dumbwaiter shaft. With a crowbar and a quiet, grim determination, she pried the boards away. The ascent up the shaft was a terrifying, claustrophobic ordeal. It was a vertical crawl through a space thick with cobwebs, dust, and the ghosts of the past. She moved with the silence and the grace of a spider, her senses on high alert. She reached the second floor. She found the weak spot in the wall the plans had indicated, a thin layer of lath and plaster. With her knife, she carefully, painstakingly, cut a small, removable section, her movements precise, her breath held tight in her chest. She peered through the small opening. She was in his office. It was a room of dark wood and rich leather, the lair of the beast. And there, on his massive, ornate desk, was the black, leather-bound ledger. She slipped into the room, the ghost in the heart of the enemy's fortress. She took the ledger. But as she was about to retreat, her eyes fell upon another object on the desk, an object that made the blood run cold in her veins. It was her husband's gun, his service revolver, the one he had been carrying the night he was killed, now serving as a grotesque paperweight, a trophy for the man who had murdered him. A wave of pure, white-hot rage, the rage she had been so carefully controlling for months, threatened to consume her. In that moment, she was not a strategist. She was not a part of a larger plan. She was a widow, and this was the man who had taken her husband from her. She forgot about the ledger. She forgot about the plan. She took the gun, and she waited. She waited in the shadows of the office, her husband's gun in her hand, her heart a cold, steady drumbeat. She would not escape. She would not retreat. She would wait for the king to return to his castle, and she would deliver a justice that was far more personal, and far more final, than any courtroom could ever provide. The brawl in the Gem Saloon was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Marshal Porter, playing the part of a belligerent, drunken fool, had successfully drawn the full attention of Silas Croft and his entire security force. Fists were flying, furniture was splintering, and in the midst of it all, Porter was a calm, calculating eye in the center of a hurricane he had created, buying Anime precious minutes. But he knew the ruse could not last forever. Upstairs, in the silent, opulent office, Anime was a creature transformed. The cold, strategic part of her mind, the part that had planned this infiltration with such meticulous detail, was gone, burned away by the sudden, incandescent rage of her grief. She held her husband's cold, its familiar weight a terrible, intimate connection to the man she had lost. The ledger, the key to the town's liberation, lay forgotten on the floor beside her. Her mission had been for justice. Now, it was for vengeance. She did not have to wait long. The sounds of the brawl downstairs began to die down as Croft, his authority reasserted, finally had Porter subdued and thrown into the street. She heard his heavy, confident footsteps on the stairs. She heard him dismiss his guards, telling them to clean up the mess. And then, she heard the key turn in the lock of his office door. Silas Croft walked in, a look of smug, irritated satisfaction on his face. He did not see her at first. She was a part of the shadows, a ghost in the machine of his own making. He walked to his desk, poured himself a brandy, and it was only when he turned that he saw her. The look on his face was a slow, beautiful, and terrible thing to behold. It was a symphony of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning, primal fear. He saw not just a woman. He saw a ghost from his past, the quiet, respectable sheriff's wife, now standing in his sanctuary, holding her husband's gun. "You," he breathed, the single word a mixture of awe and terror. "Me," she replied, her voice a low, steady whisper that was more menacing than any shout. She raised the gun. For Robert. In that moment, as her finger tightened on the trigger, as the culmination of her long, painful journey was a single heartbeat away, the sound of a splintering crash from the hallway outside shattered the spell. Marshal Porter, having been thrown out of the saloon, had not retreated. He had anticipated this. He knew the risk of sending Anime into that room alone. He knew that her grief was a powerful and unpredictable force. He had circled around, climbed the trellis to the second-story balcony, and had just crashed through the window of the adjoining room. His sudden, violent appearance was the distraction Croft needed. He dove behind his massive oak desk, overturning it, creating a fortress of his own. He drew his own pistol, and the office erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. The final battle was not the one either of them had planned. It was a close quarters, desperate, and brutal firefight in a room filled with shadows, smoke, and the ghosts of a dozen different betrayals. Anime, her cold, clean moment of vengeance stolen from her, was forced back into the role of a soldier. She and Porter, now fighting back to back, used the overturned furniture for cover, their combined fire pinning Croft behind his desk. Croft was a formidable opponent. He was not just a politician, he was a killer, a man who had built his empire on violence. He fought with a cornered animal's vicious desperation. The fight was a stalemate, a deadly triangle of cover and gunfire. But Anime, in her grief-stricken rage, had made a fatal error. In grabbing her husband's gun, she had forgotten the ledger. It lay in the open, on the floor, between them, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the shattered windows. Croft saw it. With a roar of triumph, he kicked a flaming oil lamp from a side table onto the Persian rug. The rug, soaked with spilled brandy, went up in a whoosh of flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking at the dry, paper-filled room, moving inexorably toward the ledger. He was not trying to win the fight. He was trying to destroy the evidence. He was trying to burn the truth. Anime was faced with an impossible choice. She could continue the fight, kill the man who had murdered her husband, and satisfy her own personal need for vengeance. Or she could save the ledger, the key to the town's liberation, The proof that would bring down not just Croft, but the entire corrupt system he represented. It was a choice between her past and their future, between vengeance and justice. In a final, agonized act of will, she made her choice. The ledger, she screamed at Porter. She rose from cover, her husband's gun blazing, providing a desperate, suicidal covering fire, drawing all of Croft's attention. Porter, understanding her sacrifice, dove for the book, grabbing it just as the flames licked at its edges. But her act of courage had left her exposed. Croft, seeing his one chance, turned his gun on her. In that split second, as he was about to pull the trigger, a new, unexpected player entered the game. The door to the office, which had been locked, burst open. It was Sarah, the saloon girl, her face a mask of terror and determination, a double-barreled shotgun in her hands. She had seen the fire, had seen Porter go in, and had followed, her own courage finally boiling over. The blast from the shotgun, at close range, was devastating. It caught Silas Croft in the chest, throwing him back against the wall, his reign of blood and corruption ending not at the hands of an avenging angel or a federal lawman, but at the hands of one of the many ordinary people he had terrorized. The fight was over. The office was an inferno. Porter grabbed the stunned anime, and together, they half-dragged, half-carried the equally stunned Sarah from the burning room, leaving the body of Silas Croft to be consumed by the fire he had started, a final, fitting cremation for the devil of Deadwood. They had the ledger. They had the truth. And they had, against all odds, survived. The fire that consumed the Gem Saloon was a cleansing inferno, a funeral pyre for the corrupt and violent era of Silas Croft. As the building collapsed into a roaring pillar of flame and smoke, the town of Deadwood seemed to hold a collective, cathartic breath. The symbol of their oppression, the gilded cage where so many of their hopes and fortunes had been stolen, was being reduced to ash. When the dawn broke, it was on a town that was not just physically, but spiritually, different. The power vacuum left by Croft's spectacular demise was filled, almost immediately, by the quiet, steady authority of Marshal James Porter. With the Black Ledger in his possession, he was no longer just an outside investigator, he was the town's liberator, and the sole, legitimate source of the law. His first act was to formally deputize a handful of the town's most respected and least corrupted citizens, including the old prospector, Cody, forming a new, true sheriff's department. His second act was to arrest the acting sheriff, Cobb, and the other key members of the town council who had been in Croft's pocket. The evidence in the ledger was irrefutable, a meticulous, damning account of their complicity. The rats, with their king now dead, did not even try to fight. They surrendered, their blustering authority collapsing into a pathetic, whimpering fear. The town was free, but it was a freedom that was fragile, chaotic, and uncertain. The power structure that had governed their lives, however brutally, was gone. They were like prisoners who had been suddenly released into the sunlight, blinking, disoriented, and unsure of what to do next. Anime was at the center of this new, uncertain world, but she was also a ghost within it. She had been the catalyst, the avenging angel, the woman who had dared to shatter the silence. Now, in the quiet aftermath, she found herself adrift. Her personal war was over. Her husband's murderer was dead. The fire of her vengeance, which had been the fuel that had driven her for so long, was gone, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. She retreated back to her small, mean room above the laundry, the cheers of the grateful townspeople sounding distant and alien to her. She was a hero, but she did not feel heroic. She felt only a profound and soul-deep weariness. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and a part of her had remained there. It was Porter who came to her, not as a lawman, but as a man who understood the heavy price of justice. He found her sitting by the window, staring out at the new town she had helped to create, her husband's gun lying on the small table beside her. "It's over, Anime," he said, his voice gentle. "Is it?" she replied, her own voice a quiet, brittle thing. "I killed a man, James. Sarah did. We took the law into our own hands. Does that not matter in your book?" "The book is a complicated thing," he said, sitting down opposite her. "It has chapters on murder, and it has chapters on self-defense, and it has a few, unwritten chapters on justice. What happened in that room? That was justice. Not the clean kind, perhaps. but the necessary kind. He looked at the ledger, which he had brought with him. This book. This is the future. This is the proof that will allow us to rebuild this town on a foundation of law, not of fear. You gave us that. That is your legacy here. Not the gun. In the weeks that followed, Deadwood began the slow, arduous process of healing. Under Porter's guidance, and with the active participation of a newly empowered citizenry, a new town charter was written. A new council was elected, a body of honest miners and merchants. The corrupt mining claims were nullified, the stolen property returned to its rightful owners. Anna May, slowly, tentatively, began to emerge from the shadows of her grief. She found a new purpose not in vengeance, but in building. She worked with Sarah, the saloon girl who had become a quiet hero in her own right, to establish a home for the many orphan children of the mining camp. She used her quiet, steady strength not to plan ambushes, but to organize, to nurture, to heal the community's wounds. She and Porter, two solitary, duty-bound souls, found in each other a quiet and spoken companionship. Theirs was not a fiery romance. It was a partnership, a bond forged in the heat of battle and tempered in the slow, steady work of creating a community. He was the law, the steady and yielding structure. She was the conscience, the moral heart. The Black Ledger, its work now done, was formally entered into the federal record. But Anna May kept a single page, a page that detailed the bribes and the orders that had led directly to her husband's death. She did not keep it as a reminder of her hatred. She kept it as a reminder of the price of silence. The town had been silenced by fear, but a widow's voice, first in a whisper of conspiracy, then in a shout of defiance, and finally, in a steady, determined act of building, had shattered the night. The ashes of Croft's power had become the fertile ground for a new, and more honest, kind of freedom. The death of Silas Croft and the collapse of his regime did not instantly transform Deadwood into a peaceful utopia. The serpent's head had been cut off, but its body still convulsed. The Black Vultures, the gang that had been Croft's iron fist, were now a scattered, leaderless, and desperate band of predators. They were no longer an organized army. They were a pack of wounded wolves, hiding in the labyrinthine canyons of the Black Hills, and their desperation made them more dangerous than ever. They began to wage a new, more chaotic war, a war of pure survival. They raided isolated claims, hit supply wagons, and terrorized the outlying areas, their violence no longer strategic, but born of a nihilistic rage. The new, fragile peace of Deadwood was threatened. The townspeople, who had just begun to breathe the clean air of freedom, were once again gripped by fear. Marshal Porter and his small, newly formed group of deputies were spread thin, trying to police a vast, rugged territory against a scattered, invisible enemy. Anna May, who had been trying to build a new, quiet life for herself, found that the ghosts of the past would not lie still. Her name, the name of the woman who had faced down Croft, was a legend. To the townspeople, she was a symbol of strength. To the remaining vultures, she was the object of a bitter, obsessive hatred. She was the one who had brought down their king. They wanted her dead. She began to receive threats, a dead raven left on her doorstep, a crudely written note pinned to the door of the new orphanage. The war she thought was over had simply followed her into the peace. She was faced with a profound and difficult choice. She could retreat, could allow Porter and his men to handle the threat, to become the protected, respectable citizen that everyone now saw her as. Or she could once again embrace the darkness, the skills she had learned in her quest for vengeance, to finish the job she had started. The decision was made for her when the vultures, in an act of pure, spiteful evil, attacked the stagecoach that was bringing a new schoolteacher and a shipment of books for the orphanage. They killed the driver and the guard, stole the supplies, and kidnapped the young schoolteacher, a woman named Emily, holding her for a ransom the town could not possibly pay. It was a direct, personal challenge to Anna May. They were not just attacking the town, they were attacking her new life, her hope for the future. The cold, hard woman she had been, the woman she had tried to bury, resurfaced. She strapped on her husband's gun belt. She went to Marshal Porter's office. He saw the look in her eyes and knew what was coming. "This is my fight, James," she said, her voice a low, steady thing that held no room for argument. "They have made it personal. Again? I will not risk the lives of your deputies. I will not risk the town. I will go after them. Alone. You are not a vigilante anymore, Anime, he argued, his face a mask of concern. You are a citizen. Let the law handle this. The law is too slow, she replied. That woman will be dead before your posse even finds their trail. I know these hills. I know these men. I know how they think. I can do this. Their argument was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected ally. It was Sarah, the former saloon girl, now one of the most respected members of the new town council. She had not put away the shotgun she had used to kill Croft. She held it now, her face a mask of cold, determined anger. She is not going alone, Sarah said, her voice firm. They took the books for our school. They took a woman who came here to build a better life. This is not just Anime's fight. It is the fight of every woman in this town. What followed was a moment that would become a cornerstone of Deadwood's new legend. A small group of the town's women's laundry girls, the seamstresses, the prospectors' widows, the very women who had been the most powerless under Croft's regime gathered in the street. They were armed with old hunting rifles, shotguns, and a fierce, protective rage that was more potent than any army. They were not warriors. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters. And they were done being afraid. Porter, faced with this new, formidable, and utterly unexpected army, finally relented. He knew he could not stop them. So he joined them. All right, he said, a slow, admiring smile on his face. It seems the law has some new deputies. But we will do this my way. By the book. We are not a mob. We are a posse. The widow's posse, as it came to be known, rode out of Deadwood that afternoon. It was a strange, grim, and beautiful sight, a federal marshal and a handful of his deputies riding alongside a dozen ordinary women who had been transformed by circumstance into a force of righteous fury. They were led by a quiet, determined woman in a black dress, her husband's colt on her hip, her face set like stone. Anime was riding into the hills one last time, not just to rescue a hostage, but to finally, and completely, exterminate the last of the ghosts that haunted her town. The trail of the kidnappers was not hard to follow. The Black Vultures, in their arrogance and desperation, were not trying to be subtle. They were leaving a trail of terror, a clear message to the town. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They expected a posse of slow-moving, conventional lawmen. They were not prepared for the hunters who were now on their trail. The widow's posse moved through the Black Hills with a speed and a silence that was almost supernatural. Anime was in her element, the skills she had honed during her solitary hunt now magnified by the collective will of the women who rode with her. She could read the land, the bent blades of grass, the overturned stones, with an intimacy that left Marshal Porter in a state of professional awe. Sarah, the former saloon girl, proved to be a surprisingly adept scout, her sharp, observant eyes missing nothing. The other women, who had spent their lives in these hills, knew the secret paths, the hidden water holes, the terrain of their home, in a way that no outsider ever could. They found the Vultures' camp on the second day. It was a fortified, almost impregnable position, a natural rock fortress high on a desolate mountain known as Vulture's Peak. A direct assault would be a suicidal slaughter. The Outlaws had the high ground, a clear field of fire, and a hostage. The posse made a cold camp a few miles away, hidden in a deep, wooded ravine. The mood was grim. They were outgunned, and they were facing a desperate, cornered enemy. It was here that the two philosophies of justice, enemies and porters, finally had to merge into a single, horrible plan. "We can't go in shooting," Porter stated, his voice a low, pragmatic rumble. "They'll kill the girl the moment the first shot is fired. We need a diversion. Something big. Something that will draw most of them out of that fortress." And while they are drawn out, Haname continued, her own mind already working on the tactical problem, a small team will go in from the back to get the hostage. The plan they devised was one of extreme risk, a desperate gamble that would rely on perfect timing and the unique skills of their unconventional army. The diversion would be Porter's responsibility. He and his deputies, along with a few of the best riflewomen, would stage a loud, visible, and seemingly incompetent assault on the main, southern approach to the peak. They would make a lot of noise, waste a lot of ammunition, and create the impression of a clumsy, panicked posse, luring the bulk of the Vultures out to what they would believe was an easy slaughter. While this was happening, Anime would lead a second, smaller, and utterly silent team on the true mission. Cody, the old prospector, had told her of a secret, forgotten goat trail that led up the sheer, northern face of Vulture's Peak, a trail so treacherous that no one had used it in years. It would be a dangerous, near impossible climb, but it would lead them to the back of the Outlaws' camp, to the one area they would have left unguarded. The attack began at dawn. Porter and his group opened fire, their shots deliberately high and wide, their shouts and calls echoing through the canyons. The Vultures, as predicted, took the bait. The leader of the remnant gang, a brutal killer named Slade, laughed as he heard the clumsy assault. He led the majority of his men out to the southern cliffs, eager to pick off the Tin Star lawmen and his army of skirts. While the fake battle raged, Anime and her teams and two of the youngest and most agile women from the town began their ascent. The climb up the goat trail was a nightmare. They moved up the sheer rock face, their fingers and feet finding precarious holds, the wind threatening to tear them from the cliffs. It was a test of pure, raw courage and physical endurance. Anime, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, led the way, her movements sure and steady, her calm a source of strength for the others. They reached the top, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, to find the back of the camp just as they had hoped, guarded by only 2 men. The rest of the gang was on the far side of the peak, gleefully firing down at Porter's diversion. The fight at the back of the camp was a swift, silent, and brutal affair. Anime and her team moved like shadows, their knives and the butts of their rifles their only weapons. The 2 guards were eliminated before they could even raise an alarm. They found the schoolteacher, Emily, tied up in a small cave. She was terrified, but unharmed. As Sarah was cutting her free, Anime looked out over the peak. She saw Slade and his men, their backs to her, firing down at her friends, their victory imminent. In that moment, her 2 worlds, her 2 philosophies of justice, came together. She had the hostage. She could retreat, her primary mission accomplished. That would be the smart, tactical move. That would be Porter's way. But it would not be her way. It would not be justice. She looked at the men who had terrorized her town, who had threatened an innocent woman, who were, at that very moment, trying to kill the people who had stood with her. The avenging angel, the ghost of the sheriff's widow, made a final, terrible decision. She would not retreat. She would end this. All of it. Now. She gave a single, handwritten note to Sarah. "Get her out," she whispered. "Get her back down the trail. And give this to the marshal. Tell him thank you." Then, she picked up a discarded rifle, checked its load, and began to walk, alone, across the top of Vulture's Peak, a solitary, black-clad figure, walking toward the sounds of the guns, ready to deliver her final, and most personal, judgment. The top of Vulture's Peak was a desolate, windswept plateau of shattered rock and stunted, claw-like juniper trees. It was a natural fortress, and Slade and his 5 remaining men, positioned behind a series of natural stone breastworks, held the absolute tactical advantage. They were gleefully, methodically, picking apart Marshal Porter's small posse on the slopes below, their laughter echoing in the clear, cold mountain air. They were so focused on the easy slaughter before them that they did not hear the whisper of death approaching from behind. Anime moved across the plateau with the patient, deadly grace of a predator. She was no longer a grieving widow or a reluctant leader. She was a hunter in her element, her mind a cold, clear instrument of tactical calculation. The rage was still there, a hot coal in the center of her being, but it was a controlled rage now, a fuel for the engine of her purpose. She took up her position behind a large, jagged outcrop of granite, a perfect sniper's nest that gave her a clear field of fire on the backs of the unsuspecting outlaws. She rested the barrel of the heavy rifle on the rock, its weight steady and familiar. She took a deep, calming breath, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs. She looked at her targets, not as men, but as pieces on a chessboard, problems to be solved. Her first shot was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at the rock face just above Slade's head. The heavy-caliber bullet struck the granite with a loud, vicious crack, sending a shower of stone fragments and stinging dust down onto the outlaws. It was a declaration, a calling card. The ghost had arrived. The outlaws spun around, their faces a mask of shocked, confused terror. They had been the hunters, and in an instant, they were now the hunted, caught in a deadly crossfire between Porter's posse below and this new and seen enemy behind them. Anime did not give them time to think. She worked the rifle with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. Her second shot took one of the outlaws in the chest, knocking him backward over the precipice. Her third shot caught another as he was scrambling for cover. She was not a woman anymore, she was a force of judgment, her rifle a gavel, each shot a final, unappealable sentence. Slade, a brutal but seasoned fighter, reacted with a cornered animal's vicious instinct. He roared at his remaining men to turn their fire, to find this new threat. The top of the peak erupted into a chaotic, swirling firefight. Bullets whined and ricocheted off the rocks around Anime, chipping away at her cover. She was now in a desperate, deadly duel. She was one gun against three, but she had the advantage of surprise and a lifetime of righteous fury to fuel her. She moved from rock to rock, a phantom in the chaos, her shots always precise, always deadly. She was no longer just fighting for her husband's memory. She was fighting for Sarah, for Emily, for Cody, for Porter, for the town of Deadwood, for every quiet, decent person who had ever been terrorized by men like these. Meanwhile, on the slopes below, Marshal Porter saw what was happening. He saw the fire from above, he saw the outlaws' attention turn, and he understood the terrible, beautiful sacrifice Anime was making. She was drawing their fire, pinning them down, giving him and his posse the chance they needed. Now, he roared at his deputies and the women of the posse. Charge! They surged up the final, steep slope of the peak, firing as they came, a wave of avenging law and righteous fury. The three remaining outlaws were now caught in an impossible, unwinnable crossfire. The final moments of the battle were a brutal, chaotic blur. One by one, the last of the Black Vultures fell. Finally, only Slade was left, wounded, his gun empty, backed against the edge of a sheer cliff. He stood, defiant, as Porter and his posse crested the ridge, their guns leveled. And he stood as Anime walked out from behind her rock, her own rifle empty, her husband's Colt now in her hand. She and Slade looked at each other across the small, blood-soaked plateau. He was the last one, the last of the men who had been there that night, the man whose laughter she remembered from the cellar. The widow, he spat a bloody, defiant sneer on his face. Come to finish it. I have, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying with it the weight of all her pain, all her rage. Do it, then, he challenged. Put another ghost on your soul. She raised the Colt. She looked at him, at this pathetic, broken, evil man, the last link to her past. And she saw not a monster, but just a man who had made his choices. She thought of her husband. She thought of the woman she had been. And she thought of the town that was waiting for her, the future that was possible. She lowered the gun. No, she said, her voice clear and steady. My ghosts are at peace. Yours are just beginning. She turned to Marshal Porter. He's all yours, Marshal. By the book. She had made her choice. Not for vengeance, but for justice. Her own personal war was finally, truly over. The return of the widow's posse to Deadwood was a moment that would be forever etched into the town's mythology. They rode in not as a grim, vengeful force, but as weary, triumphant saviors. They brought with them the last of the Black Vultures, bound and in chains, and the rescued schoolteacher, safe and sound. The town erupted in a spontaneous, joyous celebration. The fear that had been the defining feature of their lives for so long was finally, truly gone. In the days that followed, Deadwood was a town reborn. The weight of the corruption, the silence of fear, had been lifted. Under the steady, guiding hand of Marshal Porter, a new, legitimate town government was formed. The rule of law, which had been a cruel joke under Silas Croft, became a tangible, respected reality. Anime Collins was the reluctant hero at the center of it all. She was no longer the sheriff's widow, nor was she the avenging angel. She was, simply, Anime, a woman who had, through an extraordinary act of will, refused to be a victim and had, in doing so, become the town's founder. In a truer sense than any of the men who had first panned for gold in its creeks. She did not seek power. She refused a seat on the new town council. Instead, she focused on building. She, along with Sarah and the other women of the posse, used their newfound influence and a significant reward from the federal government to create the institutions the town so desperately needed. The orphanage she had started became a proper school. They established a real doctor's office, a library, a community fund for the widows and children of the miners. They were building a civilization, not with railroads and mines, but with compassion and foresight. Her relationship with James Porter grew, a quiet, steady thing, a bond forged in the heat of battle and tempered in the slow, satisfying work of building a community. He was the law, the structure, the unyielding principle of order. She was the heart, the conscience, the unwavering spirit of justice. They were two halves of a whole, and under their combined, unofficial leadership, Deadwood began to heal. The story of Anime became a new kind of Western legend. A story not about a fast gun, but about a fierce heart. A story not about a man who rode into town and saved it, but about a woman who refused to let her town die. The final scene finds her not in a dusty street with a gun in her hand, but in the schoolyard of the new school. She is not dressed in black, but in a simple, practical dress. The sun is setting over the Black Hills, bathing the town in a warm, golden light. She is standing with Marshall Porter, watching the children, a new generation, play in the twilight, their laughter a sound of pure, unadulterated hope. She had been a woman whose voice had been silenced by grief and fear. But she had learned that even in the darkest, most violent of nights, a single, determined voice, speaking the simple, undeniable language of justice, could be enough to shatter the silence. It could become an echo, a sound that would live on, giving hope to others, long after the guns had fallen silent. The widow's stand was over, but the echo of her voice would shape the future of Deadwood forever.